started. We're going to record this, so it will be available via YouTube after probably a little bit later this week, mid to late week, if anyone couldn't join us today and wants to watch it there. This is a webinar on school budget and tax caps. I am Christina Pretorius, the policy director with Reaching Higher New Hampshire, and we are very excited for you to be here today. I do want to quickly introduce Zach Sheehan, who is helping us out with the guest today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. My name is Zach Sheehan. I'm the project director at the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project, and very happy to be here adding some more to this topic this morning, or this afternoon, sorry.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Zach, for being here. Just quickly today, we're going to have a very brief overview of school funding. You know, what's happened this year? Where do we stand? We're going to take a couple of minutes to talk about equitable school resourcing. You know, what does adequate and equitable school resourcing look like? What does it mean for student outcomes? And then we're going to dive right in on the meat of the discussion around tax caps and budget caps and spending and revenue limitations and what we know and what we can expect and really what's next for New Hampshire. And then we'll have a couple of minutes for Q&A at the end. We're not going to take any time as we go through, but if you have questions, please drop them into the Q&A. There's a little button at the bottom, or you can drop them into the chat. Either one is totally fine. Our executive director, Nicole Highmark, or Reaching Higher's executive director, Nicole Highmark, will be moderating those channels. And at the end, we'll have some Q&A. So if you have questions about this, about school funding, the legislative session in general, please drop them in, and then we'll make sure to have some space at the end. And also, if you do find this helpful, if there's another topic that you want a webinar on, please feel free to drop that in either space too. We are always looking for additional topics to have around, education policy. And so if there's something burning on your mind, you say, hey, this would make a great webinar, drop it in. We'd love to hear it. And so with that, just a little bit about Reaching Higher. We serve as a public policy resource for New Hampshire. We believe that all children deserve a high quality, rigorous, and student-centered education that prepares them for whatever comes after graduation, whether that's college, career, post-secondary training, whatever it is, life in general. Every child deserves that high quality public education, and Reaching Higher provides people with the tools and the research they need to make informed decisions to deliver on the promise of public education. Like I said, I'm Christina Pretorius, Reaching Higher's policy director, and I do want to welcome Zach, and he can give you a little bit of the School Funding Fairness Project.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Christina. So the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project is also a 501c3 nonprofit like Reaching Higher. We operate, really kind of in a very parallel lane to Reaching Higher. And the space that we work in primarily is kind of twofold. One is informing the public, elected officials, candidates, business leaders, et cetera, about how we fund schools. And really to advocate for change specific to two inequities. One is taxpayer inequity and student equity. So really coming at this from how do we fund our schools? How can we do it more equitably? What's the connection to property taxes? And we'll dig into that a lot more later.
Thanks, Zach. And this is a meeting of the New Hampshire Education Network, which is a network that Reaching Higher New Hampshire runs. This is open to the public, and we are so excited to have everyone here. But just as a little bit of background, the New Hampshire Education Network is an information sharing hub. We share collectively the goals of providing a high quality public education to all young people in New Hampshire. Our guiding principles are really listed here. They are that high quality public education is responsive, it is equitable, it is student-centered, and it gives students the knowledge and skills they need to thrive. If you'd like to register for the network, which, we have a new message board, which we're starting to kick off, very exciting. And we also have these monthly webinars. We can drop a link in the chat, and we can also follow up via email with a registration link to that network. So we'd love to have you as part of it. You'll get updates on these webinars and things like that. So we'd love to have you join, and just wanted to put that out there. And so welcome everyone, network member, guest, everyone. So happy to have you. So just as taking a step back, looking at where are we with school funding? Because a lot of these conversations around budget caps, around tax caps, around school resourcing really center around, what's happening at the state level. With school funding specifically, it's been an issue in the state for decades now. It's been the focus of a lot of conversations. There have been 4 formal groups that have met since 2000 on the issue. The latest one was the Commission to Study School Funding that wrapped up its work in 2020. And they put forth a number of recommendations. That was the most extensive to date, where they had a contractor come in and really do a lot of data and research around student outcomes, school funding, and really how can we make sure that every student has the opportunity for a high quality public education. And so since then, they put forth recommendations. There's a study committee that we'll talk about in a little bit around, adopting those recommendations. There is also concurrently a lawsuit right now in the state Supreme Court, the Conval lawsuit, which is the 4th or 5th time that school districts, the public has sued the state over school funding. And so those are things that are sort of happening in the background as we start to talk about school funding. This biennium, lawmakers have replaced key targeted aid programs with a tax cut that our research has shown would disproportionately benefit property wealthy towns. And they cut a targeted aid program and it reinstated a relief fund for school districts. So together, $60 million of really targeted aid, 48 million of which was targeted in fiscal capacity disparity aid, which was for towns with low property tax bases, and $12 million in targeted aid for districts based on student need, allocated based on the number of students navigating poverty in a specific district, were replaced with that $100 million swept tax cut that is not targeted, that is just a broad-based tax cut, and a $17.5 million relief fund for districts based on student needs. So those programs were folded into last year's budget. This year, there are a number of proposals that lawmakers are considering as well. So where are we this year? Right now, March 2022, the state is reporting a $252 million budget surplus. And this is really important because when we talk about priorities of the state, where should we be allocating this budget surplus and those kinds of things? So there have been a number of things that have trickled out from the legislature this year. Senate Bill 420, which is currently making its way through the House, provides $15 million this year through an extraordinary need grant. And so that allocates additional funding for towns with low property tax bases. It's on a sliding scale. So it provides the most grant funding for towns with the lowest property tax bases. Think Berlin, Claremont, Franklin, those kinds of communities, and sort of sliding scale from there, really tapering off as communities have higher property tax bases. Last week, the House Education Committee did add an amendment that would add an estimated $14 million in additional special education funding. And so this would provide about $1,300 per student in additional aid for students who receive special education services for things like autism, deaf blindness, traumatic brain injury, who have multiple disabilities and things like that. So the Department of Education estimated that it would be about $14 million in additional aid this year and next year. So that amendment was adopted, and the bill has not gone to the House floor yet, but we are expecting that relatively shortly. Additionally, House Bill 1680 would rework the school funding formula and would incorporate those recommendations from that 2020 Commission to Study School Funding. This would have been a complete overhaul of the school funding formula, would be really the state rethinking how we fund public schools, how we allocate our resources. That bill was sent to a summer study committee, which we're expecting to start up within the next couple of months. The House Education Chairman, Rick Ladd, has indicated that school funding will be one of the big focuses of the study committee and of the House Education Committee this summer. And so we'll be watching that relatively closely as well. Finally, House Bill 1627. This is a bit of a complicated bill. So what this would have done would have been allowed the state to participate in a federal pilot program that would allow the state to match students who are enrolled in Medicaid and automatically enroll them in free and reduced lunch programs, would have automatically enrolled them in those school meal programs. And so it would have had the dual benefit of, those children would have access to school meals, breakfast, lunch, without having to submit any additional paperwork. They would automatically qualify. But then from a school funding perspective, those students would also qualify for that differentiated aid. So the state pays about $1,800 per student who qualifies for school meal programs. And so those with that direct certification, it's expected that it would capture more students who qualify for those school meal programs because the Medicaid and the school meal program qualifications are relatively similar. And so it just provides a larger net and would include more students. There have been figures that have been tossed around in terms of, what would that additional school funding be? I've heard the number $60 million being tossed around in public hearings and in other places. I've talked with the Department of Ed and some other places, and really, there's no way to really know what the impact would be, but it is expected that it would provide additional funding for those communities who have larger percentages of students who qualify for school meals. That bill was referred for interim study, and so whether there is a summer study committee on the bill alone, we don't know yet. However, we would expect that they would at least talk about it in the House Education Study Committee, that HB 1680 group. So lots of conversations we're expecting this summer around school funding. And so we'll be sure to, keep you in the loop and let you know, and keep an eye out for, what's happening with our content. So, that's sort of what's in the works, what they're doing over the summer, what they're expected to pass. But I think it's equally as important, given the $252 million budget surplus, what are some proposals that haven't gone through this year? And so there have been 3 recently. Last week, the House Education Committee killed an amendment to Senate Bill 420 that would have reinstated the fiscal capacity disparity aid and would have increased state funding by about $29 million. The House Education Committee also killed an amendment that would have increased the amount of Senate Bill 420 and would have added about $50 million in targeted aid to school districts. And then the Senate earlier this year had killed Senate Bill 426, which would have extended the state's enrollment provision and would have restored about $30 million in state aid to school districts who have had enrollment fluctuations due to the COVID pandemic. And so I think this is really important to note because, there have been attempts at increasing state aid, increasing this really targeted aid, but those proposals haven't gone through. They've been killed, they've been stalled. So, when we're talking about, how should the state spend the $252 million? And when we think about, the conversations that we're having around tax caps, budget caps, that kind of thing, I think these pieces are really important to keep in mind. Something else that's really important to think about and to talk about when we're talking about school funding in New Hampshire is that public schools right now are benefiting from historic infusions of really targeted federal aid from the CARES Act, from the American Rescue Plan Act, from these federal COVID relief grants. And something that Reaching Higher is really thinking about is, what will happen when that funding expires? The last of it has to be spent in 2024. And a lot of that funding, it's being used to pay for reading specialists, to pay for after school programs, to really help support students in not only recovery, but accelerating their learning. And once that federal funding goes away, what next? And so these conversations around school funding are so critical. They've been critical for decades, but now, we've seen what happens with these infusions of federal funding. And so let's reimagine what we can do with resourcing of schools and helping our students and giving our schools the resources they need to support young people and communities. And so what do we know? What are these pillars around effective school funding? I think that it's really important. We hear a lot of, oh, there are these proposals regarding school funding, or this is what school funding looks like right now. But really, what is an aspiration? What does effective school funding look like? We've spent at Reaching Higher years combing through data, research, papers, all of it, on really how can we support our students and how can we give schools the resources that they need to meet the needs of each and every young person in their community. And we found the best summation from EdBuild, and it includes these 4 pillars. Effective school funding is adequate and sufficient to support a high quality education. School funding is equitable and targeted based on student need. They hold leaders responsible and give leaders the resources that they need, but trust them to use them in ways that work best for their own communities, and they're held accountable for outcomes. And school funding is transparent, and it holds schools, state administration, and legislators accountable for providing appropriate resources. Similarly, school funding should be student-driven, recognize the community conditions that drive resource needs, and address local revenues necessary to provide fair and equitable funding. A researcher from UC Berkeley testified a few months ago in a Pennsylvania school funding case that in order for state funds to be effective and really drive student achievement up, they have to be predictable, they have to be recurring, and they have to be sustained. And if you've been to one of our webinars, you've probably seen this, but I like to bring it up because in New Hampshire, school funding isn't always predictable. It isn't always recurring, and it isn't always sustained. And those pieces are really important so that school leaders know and can depend on that funding to do whatever it is, implement the programs that they need, deliver on whatever it is they need that they know will help their own students locally. And so that's something that we like to elevate, and a point that we really like to drive home. So with that, switching gears a little bit to budget and tax caps, and really the tools that people use to cap resourcing for schools. Several states and New Hampshire communities have revenue caps. Massachusetts has one, New York has one, a handful of New Hampshire communities, like a number of cities, a couple of towns do have tax caps specifically. And when we were looking through the research, we found a couple of really key pieces. Caps on revenue and spending really constrain localities' ability to raise revenues without the consideration of the actual cost of providing services, the actual cost of providing an education. Whether that's through, right now, increased gas and propane costs. It costs more to heat a building. It costs more to provide transportation for students. All of those things, health insurance costs, retirement costs, all of those pieces. These caps don't take into consideration those really complex and ever-changing pieces. Those kinds of caps, research suggests, lead to a reduction in services, not efficiencies. And so when we hear people talk about budget caps, tax caps, we often hear, well, it'll drive efficiency in a school or whatever it is. But research shows that really that's not the case. What it actually leads to is a reduction in services, whether that's an overall tax cap where communities have to decide between funding their schools and funding their police and fire departments, or, whether that's just a school district budget cap and they have to make some really tough choices around the programming that they will offer. And so we see this play out in research that these kinds of caps really do lead to reduction in services, not efficiencies. Like, we're squeezing the lemon really hard. There's no more juice to squeeze. And so it's really coming out in programming and staffing and all of those kinds of things. Tax caps may also exacerbate disparities between communities. So studies have found that communities that have wider tax bases, who are wealthier, tend to fare better under these kinds of tax caps than those who have fewer resources. And so that really magnifies that outcome gap that we see, that opportunity gap between students. Tax and budget caps are also not responsive to school enrollment figures, to student demographics, or to other cost increases that are beyond budget writers' control. So, research shows that it costs a different, when we think about resourcing schools, different students need different things, but budget and tax caps don't take that into consideration. There's no flexibility for really personalizing that kind of learning and that environment for students based on really what they need to succeed. Looking at the research, there's a lot of research in Massachusetts specifically. They've had a statewide property tax cap since, I believe, 1980. And there has been a lot of research, a lot of data around how has that impacted student outcomes and what does that mean. However, I will say that a lot of research has shown that, there are states who look to Massachusetts and say, like, hey, they're still in the top 5. They have a property tax cap. They must be doing something right. New York tried to replicate it a couple of years ago, a statewide property tax, and really they pointed to Massachusetts and said, hey, they're doing a great job. And they have a property tax cap. This is great. But one thing in the research that has been really, really important in thinking about this is that, yes, they do have a statewide property tax cap, but the state has been really intentional in buffering that with a substantial infusion of very targeted state funding when they started out. And since then, they have set out with the intention of, we are going to support our students. We're going to support our students in those districts with the highest need. So it's those districts that have the highest concentrations of students navigating poverty. We're really focusing there. We're going to fund those schools, fund those students, give those schools the resources they need to support those students specifically. So I think one of the big takeaways in the research that we've found is that, Massachusetts may be, a point of property tax caps and things like that, but the state really stepped up and said, sure, we'll do that, but we're also really supporting you from this end as well. In a 2021 study of New York state tax caps, each $1,000 loss in per pupil revenue led to significant drops in student test performance. And that study showed that was driven by reductions in instructional expenditures, in teacher hiring, and in support personnel, which is something that we also see in New Hampshire in communities that have adopted tax caps. We see, you can see it in the news that those communities, often they have to grapple with, what does our staffing look like? Do we have to cut instructional expenditures? Do we have to cut support personnel? Do we have to cut programming and that kind of thing? So those are also things to really consider. As far as tax caps in New Hampshire go, there are several communities that have adopted tax caps whether it's through their city charter or through state law. Tax caps do affect budgets by limiting the amount of the local education property tax cut. So the tax cap says, this is the tax cap, this is the tax, and this is, so that kind of feeds in, you sort of back into the budget that way and say, okay, well, here's the budget, this is how much it's going to affect, and this is the tax cap, so we have to sort of figure out the budget based on that. It often makes school districts more vulnerable to changes in state education aid. So there are several communities right now who are going through the budget process, and because they're receiving less state aid than they did the previous year, that's affecting how much their budget can increase. You know, they may have budget increases due to health insurance costs, due to transportation cost increases, due to, you know, the cost of heating the building, all of these different things, but they have to be sensitive to those changes in state funding, that those cuts that we were talking about earlier, those targeted cuts. And so those communities are starting to have to make some really tough choices between what's happening at their school and meeting that tax cap. And we've found over the years that communities that have tax caps, it's really led to hiring freezes, to staff reductions, to reductions in course offerings and after school programs, and all of these other kinds of things. And so when we think about spending limitations, and when we think about school funding too, state school funding, how our state supports our communities, this is a really comprehensive conversation that we need to be having. It's not just one community, what's happening there. It's not really isolated. It's all kinds of different things. And we need to be having this as a holistic conversation. So tax caps have been around for a while. This year, we've found this new proposal, the budget cap. This is House Bill 1393. It passed the House in March, and now it's in the Senate Election Law and Municipal Affairs Committee. That committee is meeting right now as we speak. Whether or not they'll vote on it, not sure. Hopefully we'll know after the webinar, but we can, you know, include it in an email or whatever for people who are here. So this budget cap, House Bill 1393, it would allow districts to adopt a school budget cap with a 60% vote of their school district voters. So it requires 60% approval to go into effect. It requires 60% approval if the district needs to override that budget cap, and it needs 60% approval to reverse the budget cap. So it is enabling legislation. It is not required of all communities, but it is, if HB 1393 were adopted, it would be an option. The calculation of a school district's budget, sorry, that's a typo, that should say school district's budget, is using a set amount multiplied by the average daily membership. So the actual warrant article that would approve it would set out that amount. So whatever it would be, $15,000 per student, whatever it is, that would be multiplied by the average daily membership, the student enrollment of the previous year. And it would also account for inflation. So there is an option for the school district to adopt some form of inflation. It can be federal inflation metrics. It can be a set percentage that the school district voters choose, and that would be static. So if they adopted it 2% one year, it would be 2% until the end of time, until they changed it. It could be zero. The bill states that the inflation rate could be zero, which really pulls up a whole nother set of questions, but that is an option for the school district under the bill. And so those all together would create the annual school district budget. And so, you know, what are some considerations for something like this? House Bill 1393 does not adjust for federally or state mandated expenditures for costs of running a school. It doesn't account for special education services. It doesn't account for materials to maintain and build schools, to heat buildings, to fuel school buses. It also doesn't adjust for contractual requirements, for collective bargaining agreements with teachers, for contracts with school bus drivers, maintenance staff, everyone who would be affected by the school district budget. But interestingly, it also doesn't take into account state funding or federal funding. So if a district adopted a budget cap that said, okay, we're not going to spend more than $15,000 per student, the state comes in and says, hey, we're going to fund students at $17,000 per student. That is a consideration that would not, you know, that would be difficult. We've heard during the public hearing that the federal funding, those COVID relief funds, they would be restricted under this budget cap. And so that is also a really strong consideration. It also doesn't take into account grants, gifts, or other sources of revenue that a school district may have. HB 1393 requires that the first year of bonds, notes, and other multi-year expenditures are included in that budget cap and that budget cap is inclusive of all warrant articles. So, we often see warrant articles for trust funds, for rainy day funds, for paving a parking lot, things like that. And so that budget cap is inclusive of all of those warrant articles. A couple of other questions around HB 1393. That calculation, it's not clear on whether it requires districts to use the average daily membership, the student enrollment of attendance or residence, which is very much in the weeds. But if you just stick with me for a moment here. So the Department of Education, now referred to as New Hampshire Ed, because they're switching their name. But so New Hampshire Ed has two metrics for student enrollment. Average daily membership and attendance, which is the count of students in a specific year that are in their building, who are enrolled in any of the buildings that the district operates. So if you think about, let's take an example of Concord. So Concord operates their schools, and their Concord High School, Deerfield, sends their high school students to Concord High School. Their ADM in attendance would include those Deerfield students, because those Deerfield students attend Concord High. So it's a count of all of those children. ADM in residence, on the other hand, is the number of children who live in that school district. So in a place like Croydon, they have 77 children in residence who live in Croydon, and they may send 50 to a sending school district. So their ADM in attendance would be about 20, their ADM in residence would be 70, because they send 50 students out. HB 1393 isn't clear on which one districts use. And this is really important for a lot of our districts who have tuition agreements, who are sending schools, who are receiving schools. There are a lot of questions there. There is a question on whether it may decentivize tuition agreements in order to get that budget stability. And it may inhibit growth in towns that have adopted budget caps, because these budget caps are not, they are dependent on the year prior. And so there is a question around, if there's an infusion of 10% more students because you're building a lot and you have this big influx, that budget cap doesn't reflect that. There's a lag there. And so there's a lot of questions around that. There are also some considerations for students receiving special education services. Special education is highly regulated by the federal government. All students are guaranteed, they're entitled to a free and appropriate public education. But, if costs change, that number isn't necessarily reflected in that budget cap. So if special education costs rise by 20% one year, that 20% has to be made up within that budget cap. We heard during testimony, the state steps in at a certain point if special education costs rise above a certain number, but that special education aid is distributed for costs that exceed 3.5 times the estimated state average spending per student under state law. So if it's $17,000, you're looking at $17,000 times 3.5 before the state steps in to help out. And so that is a big consideration here for HB 1393 as well. And then finally, these kinds of spending and revenue restrictions could also affect bond ratings. We've seen other states, we've seen communities who have said that Standard & Poor's considers the ability to raise revenue in their bond ratings, and constraints could affect bond ratings, making bonds more expensive, making long-term projects more expensive for schools. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Zach.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina. I will do my best to follow that, but it's always intimidating. Christina is a wealth of knowledge on all things education here in New Hampshire, and I really appreciate how much they've kind of dug into this issue and really kind of given a good overview there. So what I'm hoping to cover for a little bit here is specifically looking at some of the things happening in Croydon as kind of a case study in some of these school budget caps that could be more prevalent if HB 1393 were to pass. And then look a little bit broader kind of, New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project, we do a lot of advocating around directing attention and energy and effort towards state level lawmakers to increase the amount of money that we're sending towards schools. And so we'll get into that a little bit. But real quick, for those of you folks who don't know, and I see there are some folks from Croydon on the call today, but back in March, there was an amendment passed to limit the amount of spending. Oh, can you go back? There was there's an amendment passed, it's okay, to limit the amount of spending to about $10,000 per student, which cut the Croydon budget by over 50%. And so some of the arguments made in favor of that amendment really mirrored a lot of the arguments made in favor of HB 1393. Basically that if, in order to kind of cut back on property taxes and as a mechanism by which, folks can help get some of that relief, we should limit the amount of money that we're spending on schools. And in our view, this is really kind of a misguided approach to addressing property tax relief. And as Christina pointed out, there's a lot of reasons why limiting school budgets can really have detrimental impacts. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so specifically to get into the property tax piece of this a little bit, since this does come up a lot as a rationale for instituting these types of caps, and specifically the school budget caps in HB 1393, I thought it'd be helpful just to kind of show where some of that argument might be coming from. So here's a chart that shows, the amount of revenue by source here. And as you can see, property taxes are by far the largest tax in New Hampshire. And there's a number of reasons for this, and the reliance on local property taxes is to fund schools is definitely a driving force here. There's also a really large chunk for the municipal local property taxes, a big piece of that coming from the state's failure to fund the retirement systems. And I wanted to kind of go back to something Christina mentioned a little bit earlier, which was this $252 million surplus that we have right now. And some of the conversations are happening in Concord currently are about reducing some of the business taxes, for example, as a way to help use some of that money. But you'll see here the business taxes, which are the BET and the BPT, so right next, the next one down, pale in comparison to the amount that we as residents and business owners pay in property taxes. And the reason I'm focusing on this again is because it really goes back to what are some of the arguments for some of these caps, and they're often framed in the terms of property tax relief. But if we really wanted to address property taxes, it goes hand in hand with education funding, because the state really does not send very much money for education funding to local school districts. Next slide, please. And so here we just have a few towns we've pulled out, a few communities that shows the difference between the cost of adequacy as determined by the state. So that's the light green bar that's significantly lower for each of these communities, and the actual amount of money spent per pupil. And Christina kind of dug into this a little bit about kind of how much it costs to provide an adequate education, provide the opportunities for our students to make sure we're meeting federal and local regulations and laws. Different communities have different needs, which can be a range of students on free and reduced lunch. It can be how spread out different school districts are, different costs for transportation, et cetera. But regardless of the different communities, you can see here we've pulled out a few: Franklin and Newport, for example, being lower property value communities, Hanover being slightly higher property value. All of them do not get nearly enough money from the state to provide that adequate education. They get sometimes from a third to a quarter of the funding for how much to actually spend per pupil. And what this does is it really shifts the burden to provide education onto local property taxpayers, which often sets up a lot of the tension and the dynamics that result in things like the amendment proposed in Croydon, kind of as a solution to this. But again, a lot of the pieces that Christina was going over, it's not really, that doesn't really get at the problem, and it has really potential dangerous effects for the ability of school districts to provide education and for the outcomes of our students. And so, as an organization, we do a lot to try to help. We have a lot of presentations that we give around the state to kind of help people understand how little money the state is giving and the high reliance on property taxes. Next slide, please. And so what this shows is relative to the amount of money that we spend on public education. So this is from the 2020-2021 year. And you can see about $3.5 billion for our public education system. And 61% of that was from local property taxes. The reason that swept is 10% and is the same color for those of you that don't know, and Reaching Higher actually did a full webinar on swept, so you can go back and get way more in the weeds about that. But very briefly, it's a statewide education property tax, but it is raised and retained locally, so we count it effectively as a local property tax. So you can see that 71% of every dollar that's raised for local public education is from those local property taxes. And the really important piece to kind of pull out of this is that, again, this is, the state, you can see the amount of money, the light green piece there is roughly the amount that the state is sending, pales in comparison to how much is required from local property taxpayers. And it's understandable that with that high burden and those continued downshifting costs, that folks would be looking for different solutions of how to fund their public schools and not rely so much on local property taxes. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so a few pieces here, and to kind of bring this back to 1393 and Croydon specifically. So for Croydon, they have a special meeting scheduled for May 7th, where they will need to be getting, I believe it's over 50% of registered voters in the town to attend that special meeting, which is a really high bar for any community if they want to debate and reconsider that budget. And there has been a lot of local outcry over that amendment that was passed. Christina talked a little bit about some of the complexities when you talk about sending and receiving schools. Croydon has a program that there's been, a lot of folks there like that, where they can send their communities, they can send their students to a various number of different schools in the area, for example, up to Newport, but they have agreements with them to pay a certain amount for tuition. And the budget cap that they just passed doesn't match that. And so now they're facing a situation where they have students that are in these schools, they're going to school in Newport, and yet the amount that they've agreed to pay is less than that $10,000 per student that they just passed. And so there's ramifications for putting on these budget caps that also really reach outside the specific communities that might be considering them. And I want to also point out that, relative to HB 1393, that Christina pointed out is actually in committee right now. They may, I haven't been listening the past 42 minutes, but they may be debating it specifically and voting on now, or it might be pushed to as late as next week. And as an organization, we do a lot of work trying to connect folks to the legislative process, make sure that people know where these policies are being debated and how they can advocate for change. And I want to highlight, for example, HB 1671, which is a recent bill that kind of created a lot of public attention. And it was the House Education Committee about a month and a half ago that really would have dealt a pretty severe blow to the core academic domains in our public education system. And there were a lot of people that wrote to their Senate, wrote to representatives, reached out to them, expressing, a level of frustration about not cutting back the offerings that we're providing for our students in our public education system, and they ended up not moving forward with those cuts and actually expanding, pieces of that, and Reaching Higher did a lot of good work promoting that. And so, as a kind of what are some of the next steps here? I think it's really important that people understand the challenges that Croydon is looking at as they're dealing with this single amendment to their budget and the ramifications that could have if more communities were adopting that, especially under a proposal like HB 1393. And it is understandable, coming from this from a perspective of wanting to have these conversations around property taxes, but it's really important that folks understand that the largest driver of the reliance on local property taxes is state level policy. And it's the state's failure to provide enough money for an adequate education. And one of the charts we just went over a few minutes ago really kind of shows that gap and how much money is being spent per pupil and how much money the state's actually sending. And so, as we really want to kind of help focus people's attention on where this issue could be solved, which is at the state level, and really making sure that we're not moving forward with proposals that could have really detrimental impacts for the ability of our public education system to provide a high quality education for all of our students. And so, I just kind of want to end with a few things, and then I know we're going to jump into some Q&A. I see a lot of things popping up in the chat here. One is as HB 1680, which is the school funding bill that Christina mentioned earlier, that will be having some work sessions over the summer. It's really important people stay engaged on that and stay up to date on what's happening there, because those conversations will help influence what happened after the election and into the next legislative session. While that is important, it's also super important that folks be talking to their candidates. As a 501c3, we also don't endorse candidates. We're a nonpartisan organization, but there's about to be upwards of 800 people running for state house coming this June, and it's really important that folks hear from them and you reach out to them and talk to them about how they're going to be prioritizing talking about public education. What are they going to be doing relative to House Bill 1680? What do they think about these budget cap proposals? Do they understand the potential detrimental causes of these? And so I think that really engaging with those state level policymakers is super important, and making sure that they understand all of this. And so I think I'll leave it at that, because I want to make sure we leave time for questions. And yeah.